Hey, researchers of the marketing kind, it's Dr. Grayson. Today we are going to discuss measurement scales. Now, this is a very important topic as you start to design your surveys because you will need to measure those actions that you think the business needs to take in terms of your marketing research project. So let's get started. What I want to discuss with you today is what is measurement, and then discuss the types of scales or levels of measurement that you can use. I'm also going to give you a lot of examples of the various types of attitude scoring and other types of scales that are used in marketing today. I want you to think about the key decisions to be made and your research so that we design the scales according to get you the answers that are measurable and actionable. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about validity. All right, so if you recall from the last modules, we spent a lot of time on variables, and I want to refresh you. What is a variable? So we have two types of variables. The dependent variable, which as you remember is what you're trying to measure, the outcome, the end result. And then the independent variables are those things that influence the decision, the outcome variable, or what we call the dependent variable. So it's really important that when you're designing your scales that you have a good idea of what you're measuring and the variables that you want to capture to make sure that you're measuring the right things. So an example, if you recall, we discussed a dependent variable as a college student could be your test score. And I, as your professor, want to know what variables impact that test score. And we want to find a relationship between the two. So a few of those things could be how long did you study? Did you study the right things? How much sleep did you get the night before you took the test? Are you a little groggy? What about the time of exam? Maybe me, I teach early in the morning and I also teach night classes. So is there a difference whether you're an early bird, whether you're taking, a regular time slot during the day or the evening? So each of these things would be the types of things that I want to know about you as I evaluate the test scores. And we want to understand the relationship between the independent variables and the dependent variable. So there you have it, just to go back and refresh if you need to. So there's four different types of scales of measurement. And by measurement, it is what we are accomplishing through collection of your data, the questions that you're asking, and how we are going to measure it. So the types of variables that we discuss is going to help you understand what measurement scale you're going to use. So there's four different kinds. So I have a nice little box here. A ratio is comparing of the absolute magnitudes, comparing of intervals, order, and identity. So a ratio scale could be example of how many units did you sell or how many units sold. And so that could be, how many items of lipstick have you bought in the last year? None? 0 to 5? I'm sorry, 1 to 5? 6 to 10? 10 or more? Or over 10. So there is a comparison between magnitudes, like an income scale. So the Census Bureau has a number of income scales you could use. So how we measure these are looking at means, medians, and modes. They're very descriptive in nature. The interval scale is comparing between intervals. The order makes sense, the identity. So oftentimes we use customer satisfaction and brand attitude, and we could average these as a mean, the median, or the mode. And also remember that we are going to be using correlation and even regression to see both, are there relationships between the variables, and is there a predictive model that we can create? Now, order matters in the ordinal scale. So brand preference, maybe you like the preference of a certain type of ice cream flavor or a certain type of coffee you purchase, and then income in categories. You can use averages, medians, modes. Again, as we talked about, we often look at pie charts and for your descriptives, and then also we could look at rank order, etc. Now, a nominal is usually done. Identity could be nominal, meaning gender. So, or brand purchase. So a nominal scale is going to be yes or no. It's binary, and we often look at the mode. So those are the four types of scales. So one thing that's really important to know is that as you're designing your surveys, you are going to have a number of options for them to respond. Now, what we need to do, and we will talk about this when we get to the measurement and the analysis section, is you are going to translate each of those responses with a number. We're going to assign a number because statistics software is numeric. So we are going to translate numbers. So how does this look? So in a nominal scale, the numbers are assigned to each of the objects or classes of objects solely for the purpose of identification. So we just want to connect a number with one of the responses. The number isn't going to do anything because it's a category. So if you're thinking of something like branding, or let's say you want to know the difference between, do people like Target, do they like Walmart, do they like to shop at some other retail store. So you're just going to identify those with a number. So example, gender, you're going to label as a 1, males you're going to label as a 2. A political party, you might have Democrats, Republicans, Independents, 1, 2, 3. Brand purchase. Did you purchase CoverGirl mascara? This is binary. It's yes or no. And then oftentimes we look at the population, the mode, the value occurring most frequently. So that is a nominal scale. Now, the ordinal scale has some sort of order that is important to you and important in your decision making. So let's look at a couple of examples here. So brand preference could be properties of the nominal scale. So ranking the mascara brands. So Clinique, CoverGirl, Estee Lauder, or Maybelline. So when you're asking somebody to rank, the order does matter. And then here we often, you can use averages, modes, etc. We can also take these and do some correlations on each one of those particular answers. Okay, an interval scale allows the comparison between the size of the difference among and between numbers. So also take on the properties of identification and rank order. So your nominal and your ordinal. So let's look here. You could combine brand attitude. What is your feeling toward each of the following mascara brands? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe 5, 1 being negative, 5 being positive. So you can take those brands that we did in the nominal scale, and you can number them here into an interval. So maybe an interval matters to you. A ratio scale is a measurement that allows the comparison of absolute magnitude of the number. So we can also take on the properties of nominal, order, rank order, and even interval rating scales. So in this case, if you were a retail organization and you're in charge of the beverage category, how many cases of each of the following, whoop, that should be beverages, were sold last month? So you could do, okay, Diet Coke, how many cases? Coke Zero, how many cases? Pepsi's, how many cases? So here we can use geometric and in harmonic means, median, modes. So it's good for you to know the ratio. So the ratio could be, 1 to 10 or 2 to 10 or 3 to 10, etc. of the whole. Now the interval scale, 0 is just another position. So on a scale, you can do scales between -1 and 1. Oftentimes you would see the Net Promoter Score, which is a customer satisfaction or brand loyalty measurement. You will see that will be 0 to 10. So in that case, the 0 just becomes a number in the equation. So what is your attitude towards credit cards in this case? You could do -3 to +3, or you could do 0 to 7. Okay, so a ratio scale then has an absolute meaning. So 0, the absence of property being measured. So example, what is your credit card balance? Ordinal versus ratio. So here, if you look at it differently, so you can look at in an ordinal scale, we could have these nice categories, and they're also in order is important. So you cannot determine the exact amount or the dollar amount, but it gives you an idea of a range. So sometimes, if you're not looking for an exact number or an exact average, sometimes it's easier and people are more likely to, especially in demographic scales, to give you a range. Sometimes if you ask the question, what is your annual household income? And you ask them, 31,512, that's going to be a little bit more intimidating than if you use the ordinal scale here. So ratio data can also be put into categories. Okay, so let's see how this works. So in the scales of measurement, the data is collected at the higher levels can be represented at lower levels. However, data that is collected at the lower level, you cannot roll that up into a higher level. So let's look at this. So it's important that to collect the data in the way that's most useful. So what income is your household income? So if I'm asking you and you say, yeah, my household income is $75,000, you can't rank up from that. That is a true number. So that is going to be, it's going to be, concrete. Now, which best describes your level of income, which is an interval scale, poverty, low, average, high, wealthy. This can be, you can take this and then you can, it's an interval which can be then brought up to a ratio scale. Now, an ordinal is what is your annual household income? Again, the ranges. It's not telling you the category, it's telling you the ranges. And then you can take the range and maybe you can say, okay, well, 0 to 1,500, maybe that is in the poverty level. And then, maybe you can go back and ask, well, what exactly is your household income? A nominal, do you have income last year? Yes or no? So you can kind of boil these down. But if you start with the lowest level, you can't create up. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So let's talk a little bit of managing attitudes. So attitudes, perceptions, and preferences are things we measure a lot in marketing. Attitudes and opinions. And what I need to tell you about this is that when people self-report, they can have their own motivations behind that. So sometimes a limitation to our study is that attitudes can change, perceptions, they're all subjective. And you might get called on this, but in our discipline of marketing, it's okay because we can find value in attitudes and opinions in regard to an object. So there's a couple common scales that you might use or think of using in your study, meaning semantic or Likert scales and semantic differential. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. So there's a summated rating or Likert scales, as you will hear me call. And basically what they are is they're a scale to understand an attitude or an opinion. So if we're looking at Axe products here, you might be asking, a male age 18 to 54 or, whatever demographics you're collecting on your survey, Axe deodorant is long lasting. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. So you are going to rank, they are going to just give their opinion on each of these, and then we are going to label them with a number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 when you do your measurement. So you're going to ask based on language, and we're going to translate it based on the actual numeric value. So most of your good survey companies, whether you're using Qualtrics, which we use in class, which I feel is the most robust, or you're doing a Survey Monkey or Google Forms, sometimes they have best practices in doing this would be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-point Likert scale. Many marketers prefer a 7-point market scale, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm actually preference with I prefer using a 5-point. So a semantic differential scale is you use what we call a slider bar or an X, and based on you just let somebody use their intuition or their preferences and have them slide. My car wash, say that's the name of my car wash place, I can take a slider or an X and say, how reliable is your car wash? And then you just kind of pull it. Yeah, it's really reliable, or I'm sort of like, in between. So these types of scales are great because you can get a really intricate number. It doesn't have to be a pure 1 to 5. Maybe I'm a 3.5 or something like that. So what happens when you do a slider scale in Qualtrics, you will get a numeric value for where the customer's actual preferences. So I like to use these scales, but I will say it is kind of troubling to use if you're doing any sort of regression or correlation, but you can do it. It's a little bit more complicated. So this is how it might work. If you were using Qualtrics, you're going to use the slider. You can do X boxes, different things if you're using a different survey software. Now, a constant sum comparative ratings is you are going to have the person take each one of the responses and have them divide it by the number, in this case 4, in terms of where they believe the value should be. So please divide 100 points between the following 4 attributes regarding women's cosmetics in terms of the relative importance. So in terms of importance, so here I've got a little Qualtrics box. It's not these here, but it's please allocate points to each of these activities based on your preferences. So they can use a slider to say, in 100%, how are you going to divide it up? So I always think those are kind of nice as well. But again, the more complicated the sliders and things like that you use, the more difficult the measurement is going to be when we analyze. So other considerations are, the number of items in a scale. So obviously, if you have a lot of different items in a scale, it's going to be a little bit more cumbersome. You need to think about, globally, can you measure this? Can you get any insight What is your overall evaluation of CoverGirl mascara? Which would be a global type of question where you could ask some, in another case, you could ask something a little bit more detailed like features. Now, the number of scale positions is important too because are you going to have a 5-point Likert scale, which I believe, or a 7? Would 6 have been better? Generally in marketing, you use 5-point Likert scale or 7. And as I mentioned before, I think the 5 is preferable in my experience, including a don't know or applicable response category. So this is always important when you're measuring certain items, such as, if you're asking them about CoverGirl mascara, which is pretty specific, and maybe you have a population of people who have purchased mascara in the back. Maybe people aren't aware or haven't used CoverGirl in the past. So it's important, I think, to always put don't know or applicable as a response category. Otherwise, you're going to get a skipped question, and that's going to probably need to be thrown out. Reverse scaling. So think about two positively worded and two negatively worded items, like long lasting and volume boosting would be positive, whereas smudges and runs out when wet is negative. So just keep that in mind as well. So those are some examples of scales. Now, what I will say with scales is, I'll talk a little bit about this later, is it's important to use best practices and to make sure that the scales you use are measurable. So how do we do that? We look at reliability and validity of your survey. And so there's three kind of ways to test reliability. The first is to test, is it consistent over time? So maybe you're using a customer satisfaction survey and you look at one period to the next. And if it stays consistent, it's pretty reliable. If it kind of moves around, there's probably something wrong with your scales. And then, so what I also like to talk about is validity, and that is the test measuring what it's supposed to measure? So face validity is, does it look like it measures the right thing? And this is what we call a gut check. And oftentimes what I will do, I'll write a question, I'll hand it to somebody, and they'll say, I'll have them answer it, and then I'll ask them a few questions just to see if it makes sense to them. Content validity is, does it test or include the right sort of content? Especially important for knowledge tests. So are you capturing everything to be able to make sure that what you're doing is valid? Construct validity. Does the test measure the theoretical underlying construct it's supposed to? So in this case, constructs are, we use something called factor analysis, which we're not going to get into in this class, but I want you to think about it. So oftentimes in marketing, we use scales that have already been developed because we know of their reliability and they know their validity. If you're using a brand new scale in academia, you need to do a factor analysis to make sure that the scale is valid. And then the criteria related validity is, does the test score relate to external criteria in the way you would expect, like in doing a correlation test? So those are just measures of validity, and we'll talk about these when we get to the analysis piece. Now, I want to let you know that survey software can help. So when you're using a software package like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, they're going to give you best practice examples that you can look at. They'll also even give you options. Do you want to do a 7-point? Do you want to do a 5-point Likert scale? I find this really helpful, particularly while you're learning, because these are based on, some of the most brilliant statisticians in the world who have created surveys through these survey tools, and you're just benefiting from those best practices. Play with the software while you're doing this. Compare scales. See what would make sense, but always remember that the scales you use have to measure the action you want to take with the research. And finally, there are some industry scales that we use in our industry. The Net Promoter Score is one. And other scales that are used that have been validated, that are tried and true. And also, what I like about these industry scales is that you compare your results to other people in your category. So I want you to think a little bit now about, have you decided what key decisions need to be made as a result of your research? I know you have, because we've gone through the hypotheses testing. We've gone through creating good research questions. So what scales will you use to measure these research studies? Can you explain the concept of validity as it relates to measuring instruments? And finally, I have in Canvas a Dr. G's questionnaire design tips and other tools that I provided you to help you think through. So make sure that you take some time to do that. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to email me in Canvas. As always, if you want to learn more from the Marketing Doctor, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.